Right on. Right on.
Good, Justin. How are you? All right. Yeah. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Team ODZ and everybody for for having me back. Today we're going to go into what it looks like to analyze your ride and using tools or metrics other than average power. So uh, in the last presentation that I gave, which was on chapter 5 of training and racing with a power meter, we talked a lot about the what's called the stochastic nature of cycling. And so what that really means is that cycling is inherently variable due to the terrain that you're riding, due to the wind, other riders, the race conditions, and what have you. So one of the first things that folks that are newer or beginning to pay attention to their power numbers realize is that it's all over the place, and it can be really hard to kind of keep track of what average power is doing. So because of that, we need to go a little deeper to start to understand what a ride means in terms of the effort that you're producing, and then really even further the physiological cost or demands of that ride, and there's several metrics that can help us do that. So normalized power, intensity factor, training stress score, and then quadrant analysis, which is a chart that helps us dig even deeper and kind of understand the relationship between some of these concepts that we're going to talk about. So um, next slide. Um, the first one that most people encounter is normalized power. And normalized power um, is a basically a really complex algorithm that takes intensity into consideration, as well as the body's physiological response to changes in that intensity, and it understands that those changes due to increased or decreased intensity are not instantaneous. So there's a lot going on in the algorithm. There's a lot to understand or kind of to digest if you break it down. So committing that to memory is not really important. What is important is understanding the concept of normalized power and how it's going to help your training. So boiled down, basically what normalized power is it's the effort, or rather the average power that you would have produced had you pedaled at a perfectly constant or consistent effort. If you could have traveled in a perfectly straight line with no wind and basically you're riding your bike in a vacuum, then the normalized power and average power would be the same. But since we know that isn't the case, normalized power starts to give us an indication of basically what your body thought you were riding at. So it brings into to the forefront the metabolic cost of the ride. So how much energy it took to actually go out for your group ride, for a race, for a workout, and it starts to paint that picture a little more clearly versus if we were just to look at average power, which would basically always have us believe that the ride was much easier than it actually was. Um, so um, it takes it also starts to look at or helps us understand the body's response to changes in intensity, and if there's uh, how that impacts our riding. So um, again, because we're not riding at a consistent pace, and riding or cycling is variable, there's another metric kind of on the heels of normalized power, and that's variability index. So VI, as it's called, is normalized power divided by average power. And what that tells us is just gives us a number to let us know how variable and how metabolically taxing the ride was, and potentially how our body responded to that ride. So really high VI lets us know that it was a very taxing ride. Um, Low VI tends to let us know, one, that it was more consistent, and that, from a metabolic or physiological response perspective, it may have been less taxing. So normalized power, really, really important metric to kind of understand, and gives us a lot of insight. Next slide. So once we understand normalized power, or at least kind of grasp what it is and how it impacts our riding, intensity factor is another big one that we can use to understand a particular ride. So intensity factor is the ratio between normalized power and functional threshold power, FTP. Um, and intensity factor is great because or due to the fact that it's based on or takes FTP into consideration. It's hyper individualized, and so it really gives us a great idea of a couple of things. One, as you ride, say throughout a season, and you produce similar efforts. Say you do the same workout every 6 to 8 weeks, or you do the same race season after season. Intensity factor lets us know or can give us some an idea of how taxing that ride was for you compared to the last time you did it, and how well adapted you have or haven't become. So if the intensity factor is lower for a given effort than the last time you did it, then that leads us to believe that you're more fit than the last time you produced that same effort. So we can take intensity factor. We can look at it in relationship to similar efforts, and we can track fitness, or at least get a sense of fitness and adaptation over time. Now, because intensity factor is individualized and it's based on FTP, then the importance of having your FTP set correctly becomes paramount. So if your FTP is set too low, the intensity factor for a ride is going to look more intense than it should be. So it's going to lead you to believe that that ride was more metabolically or physiologically taxing than it really was, which might lead you to make decisions about your training in terms of recovery and days off, or lighter, lower volume, less stressful rides. And then conversely, if it's too high, you're not going to capture the intensity of the ride appropriately. So making sure that you have your finger on the pulse of your FTP and know what that number really is and should be is going to is really going to be the linchpin to keep most of these metrics in line. So next slide. Training stress score, TSS. Most of us are familiar with TSS. Certainly, if you're using any of the Training Peaks or the suite of Training Peaks tools. Training stress score is great. So with normalized power and intensity factor, we've primarily been talking about how intensity impacts our training, impacts our riding, and what that means for our power output. Training stress score starts to take things a little further, and it helps us understand the relationship between intensity and volume. So on top of intensity, it also incorporates frequency and duration. So while intensity is important, it's not the only component to a successful ride or to any ride in general. We also have how often you do those rides, whether they're intense or not, and then how long those rides last. So the the kind of the premise that training stress score TSS is based on is that 1 hour at your functional threshold power equals 100 TSS points. So the reason that that's important to understand is because once you kind of understand that general construct, you're able to more accurately realize or understand how intense or not a ride was, how stressful a ride was, and ultimately how that impacts or should impact your overall approach to your training. So, for instance, if you did a 1 hour ride and it was 50 TSS, and that means you were riding at 50% of your established FTP. That would be a very light recovery ride. So that would lead you to believe that, say, if you did that ride today, that tomorrow you could produce a hard effort. You could do a dedicated workout, potentially something like a VO2 max effort that's going to require a lot of energy. So understanding what TSS means and how those points correlate to the training load and the intensity of a ride can really help you make kind of day to day, and as you're formulating your training strategy throughout the season, can help you make decisions about how you stack and schedule certain types of rides. Also, training stress score, because it incorporates functional threshold power, is a valuable tool because it helps to individualize your training in relation to intensity and duration. So, like I said, when you're you're going through and thinking critically about your approach to training for a particular training block or an entire season, you can use TSS very, very accurately as long as you understand its impact on the other factors involved with training, to really dial down and make sure that your training is fits you and specifically where you're at in your long-term goals. Next slide. Um, so normalized power, intensity factor, training, stress score, those are all great metrics that help us look outside of average power and help us understand, again, frequency, duration, and intensity as it relates to the types of efforts that we're producing on the bike. Quadrant analysis is a chart that we can use that kind of helps put a lot of those concepts in perspective. So very generally, the quadrant analysis chart plots pedal force and pedal velocity. And it can get more complex than that, but similar to normalized power, it's not necessary to understand all the ins and outs and necessarily all the nuanced pieces of quadrant analysis. Just knowing that it puts pedal force and pedal velocity in relation to one another is really a great place to start. So what it can tell us about our performance on the bike, for one, is it gives us some insight into neuromuscular power. So neuromuscular function is very simply how fast, how strong, and how long a muscle can contract before it fatigues. So that could be any muscle, but specifically as it relates or as it's important to us as cyclists, it tends to be the muscles in your legs. So quadrant analysis can start to give us some insight into how well our body is equipped to produce neuromuscular power and at what rate that can happen. So you can see on the chart here on the screen that there's obviously a density of points on this chart. Now, there's also a lot of outliers on the chart. So there's obviously information to be found where the density of plots is at, but also important is those outliers. And so what that can tell us is potentially give some really really valuable insight into a particular effort, specifically key workouts or race efforts. And so understanding what those outliers mean in terms of the power production, the power that we put out on the bike, and how that may have positively or negatively impacted our performance during the race or the workout. So if we won the race, then looking at what those outliers mean in terms of performance and when those occurred on the bike. And then if we didn't get the result that we want, obviously those outliers may become even more important and understanding if we could have applied effort specifically in other places. Slow and fast twitch muscle fiber. So quadrant analysis kind of couches strength in relation to or force in relation to FTP, functional threshold power, and because it does that, it provides some small window into how our body responds to different types of efforts, specifically higher intensity or lower intensity efforts, and when our body begins to utilize type 2, which is fast twitch muscle fiber. So as we start to kind of wade through the quadrant analysis chart and we start to understand what that tells us about our power production, we can begin to kind of paint a picture of what's going on from a muscular perspective and how our body utilizes and it moves towards switching from slow twitch to type 2 fast twitch muscle. And then strength versus power. So the other thing that it helps us understand, and basically just the relationship and both the similarities and the lack of similarities between strength versus power. So strength and power often get kind of combined and mixed together. Um, and they're really two different concepts. Strength is the maximal force generating capacity of a muscle. So how much force can a muscle generate? And power is the rate at which work is being done. So strength and power, although they're related, are very different things when it comes to riding a bicycle. And oftentimes, strength isn't necessarily the limiting factor for the production of power. Quadrant analysis can help us understand how those two things may be related for a particular cyclist, or potentially how they're unrelated, and that would lead us down the road to make decisions about our training. So that's a few of the things we can do to look outside of average power using normalized power, training stress score, and intensity factor as metrics, and then using quadrant analysis as a tool to understand some of those concepts and actually look at them from a chart perspective in a post workout or post race scenario. So I'll kick it over to Justin for Q&A, and thanks again for everyone for joining. No. Yeah, so intensity factor. Either one, we can start with intensity factor. So so intensity factor um, is basically normalized power divided by FTP. It's a ratio. So what intensity factor doesn't take into consideration is duration, right? So for a given ride, say that ride is 2 hours long, then the normalized power for that ride is going to be different, usually higher than your average power, and then that's going to be kind of mated up with or calculated in relation to your FTP. Training stress score takes, and we can go to the training stress score slide now. You can see the equation for training stress score there in red. Training stress score, like I said, begins to take frequency and duration, and begins to help us understand how volume impacts a ride. So intensity factor, very basically, is just how intense the ride was in relation to your set FTP. Training stress score starts to tell us basically how stressful that ride was, how physiologically taxing that ride was for the given duration, and then specifically how that's going to impact your next workout. So intensity factor tends to be a little bit more confined to particular workouts. So from a workout to workout basis, training stress score is a little bit more nuanced than that. And while it's important for a particular ride, it also helps us know how to make decisions for the rides that follow. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, good. Looks like my microphone was messed up, but I think they got the gist of it. Hopefully my microphone hasn't been messed up. Whole intro, see, but great question there. Do you have a question, Dave?
Yep. So you do a ride and you get a TSS score, and the ride could have either been very high intensity and reasonably short, or very low intensity and reasonably long. As far as your overall training at the end of the week, if you get a TSS of 100 both ways, is it in essence the same, or is it different?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not the same. So that's why kind of understanding all of these in conjunction with one another and how they play off one another is important. So, um, like I mentioned, intensity factor, and to that end, normalized power has to be in the conversation with intensity factor because it's used to calculate intensity factor. But um, I mentioned that normalized power gives us an idea or an indication of the metabolic cost. So how hard your body thinks the ride was. So you can imagine that if you go out and um, do a 1 hour ride at an intensity factor of 0.90. So basically, that's 90% of your established FTP. And then you go out and do a 1 hour ride um, at an intensity factor of 0.45, which is basically half the intensity of the zero point 0.9 ride. Those are going to be much different from a metabolic and from a physiological perspective. At the end of the day, you're going to feel much more tired after your effort at 90% versus your effort at below 50% of your FTP. And so what's important to understand there is that that's going to really impact how you lay out your training schedule. So your recovery ride at 50% FTP is going to, like I said, is going to allow you the opportunity to tackle a race or a hard workout. You would probably make another decision as it relates to the type of workout that you do if you start to do efforts at 90 to 100% of your FTP. So yeah, so all TSS is not created equal, and so you have to kind of start to look at it and understand. Again, back to that idea of metabolic cost. How much energy has it cost your body to produce that particular effort? And in that same vein, how much energy did it take to accumulate that TSS score? And so yeah, it's very different and tends to produce very different training approaches depending on the type of ride.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to add is, so in that example we were talking about, in the example of 0.9% IF and 0.45. So from a mathematical standpoint, you'd have to ride 4 times as long at 45% intensity to get the same TSS as you would at 0.9. But even then, like Taylor said, not all TSS is created equal. It's not making the same change on your body. Riding 45% intensity for 4 hours may, definitely be a long ride. It probably would not be very taxing at all. It's essentially 4 hours of active recovery. It wouldn't stress the same systems or give you as much improvement as 1 hour at 90%.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point too, just to add to that, is to take into consideration how duration impacts the equation as well. So, we get into this a lot, or a lot of people kind of go down this path because a lot of people are crunched for time, right? So is it time better spent if you want to have a 600 TSS week? Your biggest bang for your buck is not to go out and accumulate 100 TSS in 4 hours. Your best bet is to accumulate 100 TSS in an hour and a half. And from a adaptation perspective, like you said, Justin, you're going to get a lot more out of your body by pushing the intensity factor versus just trying to accumulate a training stress score. So again, understanding how those three metrics impact you from a physiological perspective, and how frequency, duration, and intensity work with all those is really probably the most critical piece for most cyclists who are trying to get the most out of their most buck out of their training time.
Yes, we had a question here in game saying, so does TSS take time into account? And the answer is yes. And one thing I want to point out in this formula we have on the screen is this can actually be simplified to intensity factor squared multiplied by the number of hours that you ride multiplied by 100.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Justin. I was
Yes.
just going to say, just quickly, the 3,600 in this equation on the slide is the number of seconds in an hour. So,
Exactly.
like I said, training stress score is calculated off the premise that 1 hour at FTP equals 100 TSS. So 3,600 is how many seconds are in an hour. And then, like Justin said, you can smash this down. But yeah, the biggest distinguishing factor between training stress score and the other metrics that I talk about is that it is the one that takes duration into account. Whereas normalized power and intensity factor don't do that or don't do it as well.
Yep. Very good. Okay. See if we've got any more questions. Looks like no more questions on here. I'm going to go ahead and pull up your contact slide so folks can get a hold of you if they have any further questions. He's on Twitter at @endurance_coach. You can also reach him at Taylor at thomasendurancecoaching.com. Or you can check out his website, www.thomasendurancecoaching.com. So let's see, we've got lots of other great content coming on the channel. So this afternoon, 3:30 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 Eastern, is a great ride called the Skills and Drills Ride, where we take, it's still a learning atmosphere, but it's a more practical on the road practicing tactics for road racing. And so Coach Ian Murray of Evil Elf Racing goes ahead and leads that ride, so you can join in Zwift. He'll chat in Discord as well as attempt to type the instructions into the game. A lot easier when you join Discord for that ride to hear real time what the methodology behind all the different approaches and reasoning for it is. So it's a great ride. If you're looking to hone your skills or learn a little bit more, probably even help you watch things like the Giro that's going on right now. The Giro d'Italia is a big stage race going on in Italy. So that'll help you get some insights as to why different things happen in that race you might not otherwise understand. So if you like the page, like the content, hit the like button, share it with your friends. We appreciate having you here. This ride is every Wednesday, 6:30 a.m. for 30 minutes. And love to have you here. You can view the content later afterwards on our Facebook, YouTube. Review it later to learn a little bit more. So thanks again for being with us. We will catch you next week.